Welcome to From Stardust to Us, in-depth conversations with thought leaders, artists, and spiritual activists, navigating the challenges of our times with integrity, joy, and purpose. I'm Bernice Marie Daly.
And I'm Linnell Hayden. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate our listeners. You can find us on YouTube, Buzzsprout, or any place where podcasts are found. If you enjoy our conversation, please help us reach more people by subscribing, liking, and commenting. So let's get into this week's conversation.
Hello, everyone. I am very happy to be here tonight with my partner, Linnell Hayden, and I am thrilled to introduce my friend and colleague, Brian Tucker. A few words about Brian so that all you listeners can appreciate what he's offering us tonight. So, as a cross-cultural spiritual director and advisor who trained with the Guild for Spiritual Guidance, Brian Tucker has worked on interfaith programming at the Vincentian Renewal Center, studied at the Bharat Sevashram Sangha, which is a Hindu monastic organization, worked with Unitarian Universalist congregations, and is a board member of Deep Time Network. Holding a degree in computer science, Brian consults with both nonprofit and for-profit organizations, individuals and organizations on human-centered approaches implementing technology. Author of Generations of War, A Family's History of World War, Brian highlights his late uncle's World War II experiences and the intricacies of generational loss and suffering from the effects of war. He blogs at interspirituality.org, and for additional information, please visit echozoic.live. Welcome, Brian. Welcome.
Welcome.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Bernice. Thank you, Linnell. It's great to be with you both.
Excited. Yes, welcome, Brian. We've been looking forward to this conversation with you for a while. So we're happy to have you with us tonight. I wanted to just jump right in because you have a lot of fascinating ideas. So let's just dive in. You have written about using the four archetypes of our collective consciousness as metaphors for interspirituality and cosmogenesis, the cosmic evolution. And actually, before we get to that, I wanted to, because a lot of our listeners might not be familiar with cosmogenesis and cosmic evolution and what is that in regards to spirituality. So maybe if you want to just sort of give us your, Reader's Digest version, a couple liners on what that means to you.
Great. Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So I appreciate that. I'll first begin by saying that the cosmogenesis idea is something that I have been learning a lot from Brian Swim, Thomas Berry, Teilhard de Chardin, Mary Evelyn Tucker, John Grimm. A whole host of people are working in this field, Herman Green. The basic idea, as I understand it, is that we're living in an era now where science has evolved and begun to tell a compelling story of the evolution of the cosmos. And they've used this with observational data, some theoretical data as well. But basically, we are kind of facing a new understanding. Instead of the fact that we're living in a static universe, it's appearing more and more like it's a dynamic, alive process. Genesis might be referred to as the ongoing birth, and cosmogenesis might mean actually that the universe is in a constant state of giving birth to itself. And so we've shifted from an understanding where we thought, perhaps we're inhabiting a kind of once and done, the universe is built and constructed, and there's no more generativity. But in fact, everywhere we look, in all the kingdoms of living and non-living, there appears to be dynamic evolutionary forces at play. So I think cosmogenesis is at first a way of unpacking this understanding that, again, Brian Swim and others so eloquently have stated in many of their books, and Thomas Berry.
Okay, thank you for that. So
So
you
had
have,
mentioned,
go ahead, Bernice.
sorry, you had mentioned some of these archetypes in your references, and I was interested in maybe connecting the dots for us around what these archetypes
Yes,
are
yes.
and what they have to do with the cosmos and you
Well,
and all that good stuff.
I'll
Just a
start by
little
saying,
question, Brian.
yeah,
Just a little
it's a
tiny
big
question.
question. Yeah, and it's a great one. Archetypes are our friends. We may not recognize that, but these are like the unconscious, collective unconscious themes that appear to be kind of ever present. And we hear motifs of these ideas in literature, in acts of creativity, and they can also be viewed as parts of ourself. I will tell you, and I'm actually, I'll first start by naming the four as I've come to understand them in a little bit more of their dramatic terms, which is to say, there's an archetype of the shaman in each of us. There's an archetype of the prophet. There's an archetype of the mystic and an archetype of the sage. Matthew Fox and others, again, have written, Carl Jung certainly have written about the importance of these archetypes. But for me, these archetypes really became close friends during a period of my life where I experienced the loss of my longtime partner, Peter, and my mom, who both passed away in 2017. And you can imagine my faith community at that time, the Reconstructionist community, they were somewhat beside themselves because we just finished one Shiva and we'd sit for another Shiva. But in that period of time, somebody was thoughtful. I got a lot of great expressions of sympathy and a lot of cards, but there's one gift. It was a stone that had the word blessing carved on it. And that stone I mulled over quite a bit. How could this be a blessing? It was really a challenge to me. And that came in a nice little bag. And I thought about so often in Native American practice, elders oftentimes keep a bundle, they might call it a medicine bundle, close to their heart for strength and courage, right? So I mentioned this to a friend of mine, and I wondered, well, what other medicine for my soul could I add to this bag at this time of grieving? My partner Peter had nicknamed me Little Feather, right? And he understood my interest in Native American culture. So the first thing that came to me was to kind of take the symbol of a feather and put it in that bundle. And I thought of that as kind of a transformative act. So it would be close to my heart and a bit of a memory. I mentioned this also to another close friend, and she sent me a pearl. So I thought about, okay, well, what is this about the sage and the pearl, right? And the quality of wisdom. My friend explained, well, yeah, in fact, we all know the story. Oysters start with a grain of sand, a little irritation, and they become something of beauty. So, what that thing of beauty is perhaps that aspect of wisdom, that aspect of the sage. So I used that pearl to symbolize the sage. She also sent me an opal, which happened to be my mother's favorite birthstone. In fact, my mother's birthstone. And this opal has this kind of fiery color to it. So I thought about the opal maybe representing that fire of prophetic action, when we all have the sense that something actually is possible while other people are saying it's impossible. So I chose that opal as a way of symbolizing that prophetic social change. So that goes into my bundle as well. And then I found also a symbol when I was traveling to India, a very simple thing, which is you'll see these often in little stores, and they're simply footprints, and they're filled with all kind of Vedic symbols. And as I understand it, one can image God by looking at the footprints left in this world. So I chose that as a symbol for the mystic element. And so I pulled together each of these elements, and I included them into that bundle. So for me, they began to slowly represent associations I could travel with and now apply them into the various areas of my life. And you mentioned one of them, which is my love for cosmology, which is the study of the origin of the universe, and particularly the Deep Time Network, which is a network that I'm a member of and a board member. And we teach leadership skills based on archetypes. We just happen to name them a little differently. But so my fascination with these archetypes came as I recognized these are partners, these are friends, and these are also parts of ourselves that we are slowly learning to reclaim. And I started to feel the value of them more and more.
Thank you for sharing that, Brian, that deeply personal story where what has led you to this moment where you can use these metaphors in your spirituality and cosmogenesis. And so I'm just wondering, what are well, you name them, shaman. Is that the first archetype? And how would that, or start wherever you like, how does that exactly correlate? How is that used as a metaphor with regards to cosmology?
Well, so now I'm gonna introduce another set of terms, which are deep time principles, and I'll try to relate them to these archetypes. You've heard of big picture thinking, and I really appreciate when people can kind of orient themselves to a larger, vaster, and evolving universe. And in the deep time principle and the system, they call that the context in which we all are operating. I happen to call that the sage, because I believe in the creative power of the universe as one of the greatest sages that we can name, the dynamic and the evolutionary force and perspective that has given kind of life over a series of at least 14 billion years, and it may be even longer with the developments of what the James Webb Telescope tells us. So the first is context, and it relates to that sage quality within each of us, perhaps our greatest ancestor. So the second element I would relate, and that's where shaman comes in. And I think of shaman as the understanding of our embeddedness within community. So not only are we embedded deeply in the human community, we're intertwined with all of life. In the deep time perspective, they call that matrix, and it's our embeddedness within this dynamic earth system. So it speaks about that for a flourishing future, human beings, we all need to kind of develop an understanding of our role in giving back to community. As I understand it, in indigenous societies, it's the role of the shaman. The shaman typically is the one who becomes, not only not through any fault of themselves, they become wounded in a particular way. And the healing of those wounds actually end up being cathartic and beneficial for the entire community. Deep empathy, in fact, is developed through a shaman's training. And in the same way, this aspect of shaman within us is that voice in us that somewhat takes the arrows of life, that suffers that grief, that suffers with life, but rather than being brought down, we're ennobled by it. We're lifted, and we find we have capacities that benefit all of life. So I see the shaman and the deep time principle of matrix as being intertwined. We develop a relationality with one another and with all of life, with Mother Earth, with Father Sun, Sister Moon. We begin to see nature as speaking in a subtlety, and perhaps directing our movement forward. So I would give that second element of matrix, associate that with shaman. The next element in a deep time perspective is interiority and subjectivity. And it shows that every living being has not only an outer life, but an inner life. just the same as we have an interiority, every being has a subjectivity, an interior. I think of that as our mystic core. And through that mystic core, we actually find that we're connected to something larger. There's a whole, a global consciousness, let's say, or an ecozoic consciousness that all of life is a part of. So it's through this interiority that we find that's actually how we as humans are evolving. We're being able to attend to that dynamic intuition within us. And our inward growth is somewhat an outward reflection of evolution as well, and a driver perhaps for evolution. So the third archetype of mystic I relate to the quality of interiority, which is a deep time quality. And then the last one, which I call the prophet, I relate to the deep time principle of action, engaged wisdom, as we're also know it as. And it's basically that it's a framework in which we understand that we have a cosmic task, each of us here in this world, and we're called to manifest that action. Sometimes standing up to power structures, showing them what can be when they're not ready for the change. We're the ones that oftentimes, when we embrace that archetype, we're embracing prophetic change. So it's that principle that we as humans uniquely are here to serve. We are among the species that help to fulfill the cosmos and complete it through our actions and behaviors. And which we all know we sorely need a larger mindset. We need to expand and change as well for the world to flourish.
Mm.
I was wondering, Brian, if you were to even just leaving it with these four: shaman, mystic, sage, prophet, archetypes, which one would you say is sort of you're living through most right now? And how is that touching your story right now, and what you're offering the world?
Yes. Well, like many of us, experiencing a great deal of change. Sometimes the frequency and the scope of the change can be bewildering. And so I'm really enjoying leaning into the prophetic side because I don't know what comes next. I wish very much, and I rely on that archetype very much. I call it, in process work, especially the work of Otto Scharmer and Theory U, the term is leaning into the emerging future. So I would say that it takes the prophetic, the Network for Spiritual Progressives refers to this also, prophetic empathy, being able to feel one's way into the emerging future. And that's something I feel almost on a daily basis I'm grappling with. And maybe the rest of you do too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is anything particular showing up again? Any callings, any particular expressions that seem to be more upfront for you these days?
Well, I come back to thinking about great works of literature, great works of music at this time, the beauty of art, the beauty of Earth. And what it reminds me of is that we as a species have like this incredible potential, moonlight sonatas and, transcendent images have been rendered thanks to art in all manner of forms and cinema. So I guess I'm right now falling back into the lap of beauty that I see the world capable of. And that's sustaining me through what is otherwise a terrible and, it's a time of great suffering. So it's helpful to be reminded of what we can as a species create at our height.
Yeah.
Well, it is during times of great suffering that the great beauty seems to explode as well out into, the consciousness. If you think of, the great music of the 60s and 70s when the Vietnam War was going on. And right now, as far as I'm concerned, poetry is just off the charts, and it comes from the wounds and the suffering, out of which come our greatest gifts, I think. What I find interesting about these 4 archetypes, I see that all life really can be just about any of these: shamans, mystics, sage, not just humans, except perhaps the prophet. I'm struggling with that. Is that solely a human in your view, or
I don't believe it is.
Yeah.
Again, you have to sort of take an evolutionary stance and realize there have been a myriad of species prior to human beings, and at each turn of the evolutionary cycle, some new adaptation had to emerge. And it must have taken, I remember a friend who talked about that great leap of the fish that put itself onto land and realized with its fins it could be walking, and then its lungs were uniquely suited. That must have taken some kind of imagination. We don't call it human, we can term it as something adaptive, but it's infinitely creative. So I really don't see the prophetic as being uniquely human. But it's interesting to note, as humans, we have an opportunity right now to stand for a sustainable future, right? We know we can look at power structures and systems, and we can figure out what's at the root of these systems of oppression, and we can change those systems. And we can lean, again, it's part of knowing that you can lean into some change and identify yourself as a spiritual change agent as well. And that's a unique role. That's a new role maybe for humans to see.
Yeah, to lead towards something good as opposed to fight against something bad. I think that makes and it could well be leaning towards a future that works for all. And it's the language of poetry, the mythopoetics. And oftentimes we can hear so much of the language of the 60s as being idealism, but it was speaking a prophetic language that today makes even greater sense. How could it be that as a younger generation, all you need is love is still so resonant and true today? So the great songs of the 60s and the great visions that we grew up around are proving themselves to be useful catalysts today. I thank my elders, in fact, for having had that wisdom. Bob Dylan, among others. We could do a whole episode just on the music of the 60s and 70s.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. I think of ourselves, as you just mentioned about elders, and I'm thinking of, well, maybe not the two of you, because I'm older than both of you, but I'll just sort of play with the idea here of being ancestors for the future, that we, in fact, are the ancestors for the future. And I've really been moved by that idea.
Yeah.
And in thinking about assuming the human species survives the cataclysms that are headed our way, assuming there are survivors of that in whatever time period that is, we're the ancestors, and how do we transmit to them, and what do we want to transmit to them? What do we want to offer them? So by way of the shaman, perhaps, and the prophetic, and the sage, and the mystic, or others as well, and how to do that. And I don't know that this podcast or any podcast is going to be, functioning if electricity is going to be working then, or who knows what. But that, what do you imagine would be, what would we want to hold on to, envision for the future for these young folks? I know a number of people very recently who have had children, and they're like little babies we're talking about. And we also know what's going on in parts of the world right now that is catastrophic in regard to children in particular. So anyway, I was just wondering what that might be and how you might think about it, and what you might imagine for them, and what we would want to
Yeah,
give them if we could.
what we would want to give them. Well, a great teacher right now for me still is Thomas Berry, and
Mm,
the four wisdoms for the Ecozoic era still rings true. And I believe Thomas is saying at a minimum we need to align ourselves back with an indigenous understanding of reality. So the wisdom tradition of the indigenous needs to be reclaimed in our time. It's the wisdom also of women, of a feminine quality of spirituality that needs to come into the fore right now. And it's not to say that the masculine aspect should be left behind, but it has to be brought into better balance, right? So wisdom traditions of women needs to be encouraged and allowed to flourish in the world. And the power of science and spirituality, science and religion needs to be respected. Science is a powerful mover of our evolving understanding of the nature of reality, right? And
mm,
then this is where the interspirituality piece comes in. The great wisdom within all of the world's traditions needs to be reclaimed. So the fourfold path that Thomas has laid out, Thomas Berry, a great theologian and exponent of the new story with Brian Swim, I think is a start and something I'm excited that in so many ways the story can be told for younger people. And I
mhm.
don't mean it as a grand narrative. I mean it as a story alongside other cultural stories throughout this planet. It's a compelling story that should be heard alongside other cultural stories.
Yeah, a new story of how we stepped into being fully human. I think we deny a lot of our humanness, the light that we can give to the world and to future generations. Get caught up in the suffering and the wars and the greed and all that. But what I love about these, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, no, I was going to totally change the subject. So if you had a comment on that.
No, I was just going to add, and just to clarify, if the readers or listeners haven't heard of the new story, it's a science-based narrative, and it starts with how right now we understand cosmology, which is subject to change every day. But it's the notion from the time of the Big Bang, there has been a increasing complexification from the first of elements of hydrogen to helium to from proton, neutron to electron. The way that the elements have combined and the sequence of events can be told as a narrative. It's called the new story because an old story did not even posit the possibility of a universe that's 13.7 or 14 billion years. Our ancestors in the 1800s might have been operating off of an idea that the universe was like thousands of years, like in the Bible. But the science is now showing us, in fact, this universe has come, and it may not be the only flaring forth. It may have been one in a sequence of flaring forths and coming back together again. But it's a compelling way of looking. And that's what I mean by context also, and sage, that sage archetype that science is so well positioned right now to help us move into. That can be, that new story has a transformative place alongside other stories of world culture.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that initial spark flaring forth is continuing to evolve in ever, complex beings and levels of consciousness. We're here sitting today speaking with each other because of that first initial spark, and it's continuing to evolve.
Exactly.
I just lost my thought.
That's the cosmogenesis that we were talking about earlier, continuing
Yes.
to evolve. It's not a once and done deal, is it? That same spark is alive every moment with us.
Yeah. Still happening. Still happening.
Still happening.
Right. I can jump in until you gain your thought, or did you get your thought back?
I think that it's still floating out in the ether and the cosmology.
Okay, let me ask you then, Brian. You have uh, quite a deep and broad view of spirituality, which I mentioned a little bit of in my introduction. I can't give you a whole life story right here, right now, but let me ask this question. How do you hold those together? And you must feel they're important individually perhaps, but it's the holding together of them that I want to ask you about. Why is interspirituality essential for your own spiritual journey process?
Well, it's been essential for me. My birth tradition, as many of us started out in a faith path. I started out as a Reformed Jew growing up in San Diego, California, and my brother and I were rather disaffected by our Judaism. It was at best
Mhm.
a symbol that we knew made us different and got us out of school a couple times a year, and we'd have extra holidays we'd get to have, along with Christmas. But it became apparent to us growing older that the wisdom within our tradition needed to be retold. And often we found in studying other religions, and my brother led the way actually. He was the first one to kind of introduce me to Hinduism. And it showed that there's a much vaster and perhaps older, more ancient understanding of this cosmos and the nature of consciousness. And I was
Mhm.
fascinated. And I think when I went through also the training program called the Guild for Spiritual Guidance, the 2-year formation, kind of a spiritual formation process, I was exposed to what I thought of as being the depth of Christianity, which I had not really had the benefit of. I
Mhm.
only saw what were, rather unusual forms growing up, and the Guild helped me crack open a deep mystic impulse present within Christian thought that I could relate to. And how could it be
Mhm.
that this deep mystic thought was similar to deep Jewish mystic thought? We
Right.
had common origins, and
Mhm.
as we do in archaeology of religion, we find out we all have common origins in one
Mm.
way or the other, and each religion has a particular giftedness about preserving something essential that perhaps other faiths might not value. That's to me the benefit of bringing together people from different perspectives. And as we all know, like that's the value of diversity. Together we're stronger. All of our religious voices together, there are ways of finding that core truth and that core spirituality. For me, it's compelling. It's a compelling way to discern truth from fiction. Is
Mhm.
listen to multiple perspectives.
Mhm. Mhm. Do you practice each of these different modalities on a weekly basis
Well, I would say because I'm
or
right now
regular basis,
comfortable.
I should say,
Yeah,
just a regular basis? Yeah.
yeah, I'm comfortable honoring my Jewish ancestry. I'm comfortable incorporating meditation practice in my day. Uh, you know, as I encounter other forms, there are techniques of altered consciousness that one uses with simply rattling and drumming, which I find to
Hmm.
be useful. There are things you can do with the breath as well that allow you to
Hmm.
kind of gain insight. So I would say that I try to adapt the practices that my body tells me and my spirit tells me
Uh,
this fits. And
okay.
the ones that
Right.
don't right now, I just have to say I don't. It's not right now. I'll put it aside. Uh,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
so
So it
there's a
moves.
process of discernment.
It
Yeah,
goes
one
around. It moves
rather
around.
than
Yeah.
trying to do everything, one could certainly not, and I wouldn't encourage it. I would encourage you to trust your own discernment. What
Right.
practice resonates with you right now,
Right.
and from
Right.
what faith tradition? Yeah.
So you did mention that it was important that we each reach back into our ancestry, which to uh, our indigenous ancestry, and find our roots again that way, so that we can move forward with some sort of living planet that we can give to the future generations. So is that, I guess, my question is, because when I hear that, I don't think it's possible in our time in the 21st century to go back to the origins as they were. So is that what you're speaking of now, where you just sort of use what resonates with you now, or can you sort of expand on?
I'm not imagining a mythic past where, you know, there was great harmony that we're all trying to get back to. I'm rather saying, in fact, there are indigenous voices among us that have, through a very systematic method, been excluded from our cultural, you know, understanding, and that it's time to reclaim and allow those elders to step forward. And as they're willing to share, you know, this is globally, you know, here in the United States, we encounter this in the Native American, you know, in Australia, they might encounter it in the Aboriginal, you know, throughout the world. There in India, there's an indigenous in India. There are ways that we can allow that understanding of reality to work alongside a Western understanding. And I'm particularly interested in where are those dialogues happening, where there's a kind of inquisitiveness. Especially science right now seems to be fascinated with how accurate or how deep an understanding an indigenous way has compared to the scientific. There are great parallels that can be drawn. So I'm more imagining that my indigenous elders have been on this journey much longer than have I, and it would be appropriate to be humble and to allow ourselves to listen and hear their voices more fully.
Beautiful.
Well, I have one more. If we have a few minutes left, I think. This is going to be a 180-degree turn here, Brian. Multi-talented person that you are work with computers all the time, right?
Yes.
So tell us a bit about that and how you see that for the future. And everybody's talking about AI and that you're with these machines, you know, and know well how to
Yes.
create art. I've seen beautiful art of yours. In any case,
Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. So what can we say as a person who is very involved with technology on a daily basis? What can you say about technology, how that works with all of this, and how we're evolving?
Well, it's an exciting time for all of us to be a part of, and I've had the benefit of well over 30 years of career in technology. And I remember when I first entered into it, you know, that and mathematics, it captured my imagination. I was just so amazed to see how you could take an applied science like computer science and produce so many different expressions of systems. And I have to say that I've also been disappointed at times too in how technology has failed and has not promoted greater coming together. And I think the potential right now is it will really be up to us to see how we partner with artificial intelligence and how it can be seen as a guide and an agent for change. And my hope is with things like there's a lot we're learning in the computer world from the design world. The design world teaches us how to create systems where the user experience and also the possibility of user transformation is possible. So there are online communities right now. The Nearness is one that I can think of, and certainly the Deep Time Network, where we gather people from around the world and we have a multimedia experience learning from other elders and teachers about deep time leadership. You know, so there are ways to use social networks so that there's an advancement of the human spirit rather than a diminishment. There's ways to use AI so it stimulates the creative impulse in us. It doesn't deaden it, right? And the same is true. Our cell phones can become agents for us to tune into nature and each other. They don't have to become devices of distraction. So I'm excited about the field because there's so many young people right now that are seeing that potential. They know the technology, but they don't always have great frameworks to come from. And they very much want new ideas. how can technology be used in a way that promotes the flourishing of life on this planet? And it's
Right.
an exciting challenge that we live in right now.
Right.
Oh, I
Thank
think
you.
everybody's asking that question. There's a lot of angst out there with AI and all that. So thank you for that that answer. That gives me hope. I'm glad to hear that. So yeah, I think that we're coming to an end. I want to honor your time with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us, Brian. It's been fascinating. You're a fascinating person with great ideas. I love the archetypes. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to let our listeners know where they can find you, find out more about your work.
Sure. Yeah, so I blog on a site called ecozoic.live, and you can just https ecozoic.live. You can also find, you'll find my writings on interspirituality.org as well. So
Right.
Wonderful.
Right. And some artwork, I might add, because you
yes.
almost always include some kind of artistic expression, which is, bring me in a whole other dimension of
I'm really appreciating it's this element, and Linnell, you referred to it. The mythopoetic is one of the most essential tools to us and our imagination right now. So I love finding ways, as it's combining the arts and technology and spirituality. I think that's kind of the merger for the future.
That's Brian. There you go. That's Brian.
Yeah,
I want to just add that, let our listeners know that the three of us have been participants of the Guild for Spiritual Guidance and work together in programming that and in offering programs for folks who are interested in all these topics. Brian has been involved with that for at least 15 years that I know of, and probably longer. And Linnell has also completed that program in the last couple of years. And his program's open to the public. So we just want to give a little shout out to the Guild for Spiritual Guidance, spiritualguidance.org. There you go.
Yes.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian.
No, it's so great to be with you both tonight. So
lovely.
the conversation.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. When the Ripe Fruit Falls, from the Complete Poems of D.H. Lawrence. When the ripe fruit falls, its sweetness distills and trickles away into the veins of the earth. And when fulfilled people die, the essential oil of their experience enters the veins of living space and adds a glisten to the atom, to the body of immortal chaos. For space is alive, and it stirs like a swan whose feathers glisten silky with the oil of distilled experience.